The room went quiet before anyone even realized why. A young woman was on her knees in the center of a private casino, surrounded by men who had ended lives for far less than what she had just done. She had tried to steal from the most dangerous man in the building, and now he was staring at her, calmly, not angry, not shouting, just watching. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from patience, it comes from power. From the certainty that whatever happens next, he is the one who decides it. And when men like Robert John Burke go quiet like that, it usually means someone isn't leaving the room alive. Her name was Grace Hendricks. She was 23 years old. Her hands were pinned behind her back. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. Instead, he leaned forward slowly and said just one sentence in a calm voice that made the air feel heavier.
"You'll be punished for this."
The woman swallowed hard but didn't cry. She only lifted her chin, and as he stepped closer to her, something around her neck caught his eye. A small silver locket. The moment Robert noticed it, something in his expression changed in a way none of the men in the room had ever seen before. Before we reveal what happens next, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. We genuinely love seeing our global community grow. If you find yourself caught up in the tension of stories like this, make sure you're subscribed so you're always here for the next one. But for now, we have to go back to the moment it all started.
To truly grasp the tragedy of that winter night, we have to look away from the chaos for a moment. We have to look back. Specifically, we have to look at a woman named Samantha Groves. Because in the grand architecture of this mystery, Samantha wasn't just a witness. She was the foundation. Without her, none of this makes a lick of sense.
Samantha was the kind of woman who built things slowly and kept them. She was not someone who looked for shortcuts or leaned on other people when she could stand on her own. She had grown up watching her parents work hard for everything they had, and she had taken that in early and made it part of who she was. She studied hard. She worked while she studied. She graduated and found steady work doing what she was trained for. She was careful with money, careful with trust, and careful with the kind of hope that can get a person into trouble if they're not paying attention. She was, in almost every way, someone who had thought clearly about the life she wanted and had set about building it without waiting for anyone to hand it to her. She was also, and this matters, someone who fell in love exactly once in the way that changes a person permanently. Not because it ended well, but because it didn't, and because of what it left behind. His name was Robert John Burke, and the version of him that Samantha knew, the version she fell for, honestly and completely, was the version he chose to show her, the man who showed up consistently, who listened carefully, who remembered the small things she mentioned in passing, who made her feel, for almost a year, like she was the most important thing in whatever room they were in together. That version was real enough to touch, real enough to trust, real enough that when she realized she was pregnant 9 months into knowing him, her first feeling, underneath the fear, was something close to hope. She believed in what they had built. She sat across from him one afternoon with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, and she told him, and she watched his face while she said the words, and what she saw there, just for a second before he put the composure back, was not what she had been hoping for. It was not warmth. It was not joy. It was the look of a man doing cold arithmetic, running the numbers on a situation rather than feeling something human about it. He told her he needed to think. He said he'd be in touch. He called 3 days later and told her, in a voice that was steady and completely final, that a child didn't fit into his life at this stage, that he would help financially, that the cleanest thing for everyone would be to keep it simple. He used the word simple the way people use it when they mean something smaller, something contained, something that disappears quietly.
Samantha hung up the call and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. She wasn't surprised, exactly, but she had believed, she had really, genuinely believed that she meant enough to him to shift the calculation. She had been wrong about that, and she sat with that wrongness for as long as she needed to, and then she got up and got on with it. She finished what she had started academically. She moved back in with her family for a period to save what she could. She found work, and in the spring, she gave birth to a baby girl she named Grace. Grace Hendricks. Her name, not his. That choice was deliberate, and it was final, and she never revisited it. She did not tell Grace her father was a bad man. She did not build resentment into her daughter the way some parents do, dripping bitterness into the water supply of a child's understanding until everything tastes like it. She told Grace, when Grace was old enough to ask and young enough to still need simple answers, that her father had made choices that took him somewhere else, that it had nothing to do with Grace, that Grace was the best thing that had ever happened to her. She said it steadily. She said it often enough that Grace mostly believed it. But there's a kind of grief that lives in children who grow up with an absent parent, a quiet, persistent ache that nobody has to name for it to be felt. Grace carried it. She carried it the way she carried most things, quietly, practically, without making a production of it. She was her mother's daughter in that way above all others. What Samantha kept, and this is the detail that matters more than almost anything else in this story, was a small silver locket on a thin chain. Inside it was a photograph taken on a warm evening many years before Grace was born. The two of them, together, Samantha laughing, Robert with his arm around her shoulder, both of them looking for just that split second frozen in the image, like ordinary happy people with no idea what was coming. Samantha kept the locket not out of longing. She had long since moved through that and come out the other side, but because it was the only physical record of the circumstances that had produced Grace. It was not a symbol of loss. It was a record of origin. When Grace was 16, Samantha sat her down on a quiet morning and told her more of the truth than she had told her before. She told her his name. She told her he was a powerful man who operated in a world that had very dangerous edges, and that those edges had made him into someone who chose his own safety over everything else.
She told her she had loved him honestly, and that he had made a choice she couldn't make for him. And then she unclasped the locket and placed it in her daughter's hands and said,
"I want you to have this.
"Not because you owe him anything, but because you deserve to know where you come from. And this is the only honest piece of that time I kept." Grace held it for a long moment. She opened it and looked at the photograph. Her mother, laughing, a man she had never met. She felt something she didn't have a word for sitting at the back of her throat. She put the locket on, and she wore it every single day from that morning forward, because that is who Grace Hendricks was. She understood the weight of what her mother gave her, and she carried things carefully. Now, here is what you need to know about Samantha at the time this story takes place. She was 46 years old. She had built a good life, a genuinely good one on her own terms, without asking Robert John Burke for a single thing, ever. She had her work, which she was respected for. She had her home, which she had earned. She had Grace, who was the most complete thing in her world. She was not a woman defined by what had happened to her over 20 years ago. She had put it in its proper place, but she had never fully closed the drawer on it either, and she knew it, and she had made her peace with knowing it. She still wore the locket sometimes, on certain days, when she was feeling something she couldn't quite name, but always recognized. And Grace noticed. Grace had always noticed, even when she said nothing. Pause for just a moment and think about what it means to carry something like that over 20 years. Not with bitterness, not with drama, just quietly, putting it in the back of the drawer and getting on with your life. Do you know someone who does that? Have you ever done it yourself? Tell us in the comments, because this story is full of people carrying things quietly, and we think a lot of people watching will recognize that feeling. Now, back to Grace. By the time Grace was 23, she had a degree she was underusing, part-time work that paid less than her bills required, and an apartment she was falling behind on. She was not asking for help. She had not been raised to ask for help, and she was not about to start. But the distance between what she earned and what she owed was growing in a way she was running out of room to manage, and she had been thinking for months before the night everything changed about the name her mother had given her when she was 16, Robert John Burke. She had been thinking about it the way you think about a door you have never opened, not obsessively, just with the low, persistent awareness of something that has never been resolved. And then one evening she asked her mother directly, not about the locket, not about the old story. She asked,
Do you ever think about finding him? Not for yourself, just to know what he became.
Samantha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said,
I know enough about what he became to know it isn't a world either of us should go near.
Grace said, but I want to see him. Samantha looked at her the way mothers look at adult children when they can tell a decision has already been made and they are deciding how much to say about it. She said carefully, if you go looking for this man, you need to understand that what you find might not be something you can walk away from cleanly. Grace said she understood. Samantha said she didn't think she did, not yet, and she left it there. Because Grace was 23 and had her own right to her own decisions, and Samantha had long ago understood that the job of a parent is not to make every choice for your child, but to make sure they have the truth in their hands before they make their own. What Samantha didn't say that evening, what she had never said out loud to Grace or to anyone, was that she had spent over 20 years quietly wondering whether Robert ever thought about what he had walked away from. Whether he had ever lain awake the way she had lain awake in the weeks after that call, staring at the ceiling, running the arithmetic of a decision, and finding it came up short every time. She had never fully admitted to herself how much the answer to that question still mattered to her. She put it away the way she always put things away, and got on with the week.
Grace started digging. She was methodical. Her mother's daughter, right down to how she approached a problem. She worked through what was publicly available first. Business records, filings. She found the freight company. She found the other businesses registered under connected names. She found old references in public documents that mapped the outline of who Robert John Burke was and how he operated. She found a name that kept appearing in the margins, John Nolan, described variously as a business associate and a consultant, though what exactly he consulted on was never made clear. She found references to Kevin Chapman listed in older documents as a company contact, though he had no obvious professional qualifications that would explain the role. And eventually, through a contact who didn't realize how much they were sharing, through a permit filing that mentioned a private members club, through the patient accumulation of small things that by themselves meant nothing and together meant everything, she found what she was looking for: a private casino, a members-only operation on the upper floors of a building in a part of the area where people with money and power went when they wanted to be somewhere that didn't officially exist, a place where Robert John Burke spent certain evenings. She did not tell her mother what she had found. That act of withholding from the person she trusted most in the world was the thing she would feel most complicated about in the months that came after, because Samantha would have told her not to go, and Grace knew that, and she went anyway. She got inside on her third attempt. It cost her the last significant money in her account to borrow a name on a guest list for one evening. She went in, found a seat away from the center of the room, ordered a drink she didn't touch, and watched. She saw John Nolan first, seated close to the man she had come to see, watchful and still, in the way of someone who is always calculating. She saw Kevin Chapman positioned slightly behind, arms folded, eyes moving steadily across the room. She saw another man near the entrance, John Reese, who stood with the particular alertness of someone whose job was to notice things before they became problems.
And then she saw Robert John Burke, seated at the center of the room as if the room had been arranged to accommodate him. She had spent 23 years with only a thumbnail-sized photograph to go on. The man in that photograph and the man in this room were connected by something she could feel before she could explain it. She watched him for 20 minutes. He was at ease. He was in his element. He was completely comfortable being the person that every other person in the room was aware of and gave space to. And Grace felt something she had not expected, not warmth and not hatred, but something hollow and cold. The feeling of looking at a stranger who is supposed to mean something and finding that meaning doesn't come automatically. It has to be built, and she didn't have time to build it tonight. She thought about her mother, about the morning at the kitchen table, about all the things Samantha had never quite finished saying. And then she did something she had not planned to do. At a table nearby, a jacket had been left draped over a chair while the man it belonged to stepped away. She could see a wallet in the inner pocket. She was behind on rent. She was sitting in a room built on wealth that had, for her whole life, represented the man who had chosen not to exist for her. She reached for the jacket. Her fingers touched the fabric, and then a hand closed around her wrist from behind.
60 seconds after that, she was on her knees on the marble floor of the casino. The room was completely silent, every face turned toward her. 2 security men held her in place. Robert John Burke looked at her from across the floor with the calm of a man who had all the time in the world to decide what happened next. John Nolan stepped forward and said quietly, "What do you want done with her?" Kevin Chapman cracked his knuckles. Grace did not look down. She looked straight at Robert the way her mother had always told her to look at the things that frightened her, directly, without flinching. And Robert spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words reached every corner of the silent room without any effort at all. "You'll be punished for this." The words settled over everything like a weight. Grace held his gaze. She didn't beg. She didn't speak. She waited. And then his eyes dropped. They moved from her face to her collarbone, to the thin silver chain, to the small locket catching the light of the chandeliers above her. He stopped. Something happened in his face. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change you could easily describe to someone who wasn't there. But John Nolan, who had been reading this man for 15 years and knew it the way you know a road you have driven every day, saw it instantly. Something structural, something giving way quietly beneath the surface. Robert's voice came out slower than before, quieter. "Where did you get that?" Grace looked down at the locket for just a second, then back up at him. "It belonged to my mother." The silence changed. Everyone felt it shift without being able to say exactly why. Robert extended his hand. Grace reached back, unclasped the locket, and placed it in his palm. He stood very still. Then he opened it. And what happened to his face in the 10 seconds after that was something the men in that room would come back to in quiet conversations for years afterward. His hands tightened around the locket. His jaw set. His eyes went somewhere that no one else in the room could follow him. He stood very still for a long time. John Nolan said his name once. He didn't respond. He closed the locket. He looked up at Grace. He looked at her face the way you look at something when the 2 pieces of a thing are trying to connect inside you and won't quite finish connecting. He could see something in her face that he recognized without being able to name yet. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "What was your mother's name?" Grace held his gaze. She made the decision in real time. "Samantha Groves." He absorbed that. He nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he had already worked out and was hoping he'd gotten wrong. He said, "And your name?" She said, "Grace."
He said it back once, quietly, the way you place something fragile somewhere you want it to stay safe. Then he looked at her for a long time, really looked, the way you look at something you understand you almost destroyed before you knew what it was. His voice came out barely audible. "She never told me." Grace said, "She didn't think you'd want to know." Those 7 words landed in the room with a weight that no one had been prepared for. Kevin Chapman looked at John Nolan. John Nolan looked at the floor. The guards released Grace's arms without being told. She got slowly to her feet. She waited. A full minute passed, maybe longer, before Robert turned back around. His face had settled into something composed, but it was not the same composition it had been when she was brought into this room. Something had cracked open in it that was not going to close tonight. He looked at Grace. He said, "Come with me." She said, "Why?" He said, Because there are things I need to say, and this is not the place to say them." She looked at him steadily. Then she walked toward the door he was holding open. "Stop here for a moment. Really stop. Think about what Grace was carrying as she walked through that door. She had just told a man who had been about to hurt her that his name was connected to hers by blood. She had watched his face crack open when she said her mother's name. And now she was following him, alone, into a back room in a building full of people who answered to him without question. Would you have done it? Would you have trusted that the locket, that one small silver locket, had changed something deep enough to make the next few minutes safe? Or would the fear have been too loud to walk through? Tell us in the comments, because that question doesn't have one right answer, and we think about it more than you might expect.
The office at the back of the building was quiet, dark wood, a window looking out over the lights of the area outside, bookshelves with actual books on them, which surprised her more than she expected. He set 2 glasses of water on the desk and pushed one toward her, such an ordinary gesture inside such an extraordinary situation that something almost broke through her composure. She sat across from him with her hands folded and her face held carefully together. He sat back and looked at her for a long time before he said anything at all. He said, "How old are you?" She said, 23. He said, "She was 24 when we met." He said it the way you say something when you need the numbers out loud to make it feel real. She said, "She told me your name when I was 16. She told me you were someone powerful who had chosen a world too dangerous to come back from." He said, "That's accurate." Then, after a pause, "Is she all right, Samantha?" Grace said, "She's fine. She built a good life. She's been in her field for years. She owns her home. She's good." Something moved through his face, briefly, quickly, complicated. He said, "I'm glad." She said, "Are you?" Not aggressively, just honestly. He said, "Yes, more than I could properly explain right now." She asked him why. She had been carrying the question for 7 years, since the morning her mother placed the locket in her hands, and she asked it the way you ask something when you have waited long enough that you are not angry anymore, just direct. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because the life I was building was not one I could bring a child into without knowing with absolute certainty that I was placing them inside something that would eventually hurt them. I told myself that stepping away was the clean choice, the protective one." He paused. "I've had a long time to understand that was partly true, and partly a reason I gave myself to make a selfish decision feel considered. I was afraid of what it would cost me to stay. I dressed that up as something more honorable and told myself the story often enough that it started to hold." The office was very quiet. Grace said, "She never told you she hated you. I thought you should know that. She was hurt. She raised me alone, and she worked very hard, and some nights when she thought I was asleep, I could hear her just being tired, the particular kind of tired that comes from carrying something for a long time. But she never made me hate you. She gave me the locket. She gave me the truth. She let me make my own decision about what to do with it." He looked down at the locket resting on the desk between them. He was quiet. Then he said, "She was always like that. She never made things ugly when she could make them honest instead. It was one of the first things I noticed about her." The room held that for a moment, both of them sitting with the weight of it. He looked up. He said, "I would like to speak to her, if she's willing. I'm not asking you to arrange it or push her toward it. I understand I have no right to ask, but I would like her to know, if she ever wants to hear it, that I am sorry. A real sorry, not a qualified one." Grace looked at him for a long time. She said, "I'll tell her. What she does with that is her choice." He nodded. He picked up the locket and held it out to her. She took it, turned it once in her fingers, and clasped it back around her neck. He watched her do it. He said, "She kept it all those years." Not a question. Grace said, "She kept it in the back of her jewelry box, but I think she took it out sometimes, on certain days. She would never say so, but I noticed." He said nothing. He looked at the desk. The silence between them carried something. She stood to leave. He stood too, old habit, deep in the muscle memory before everything else existed. He said, "There's a financial analyst position at the freight company. Legitimate work, well compensated. I'm not offering you anything complicated. I'm offering you something clean." She looked at him. "You're offering your daughter a job?" He said, "I'm offering a qualified person a role they would be good at. What she is to me doesn't change what the work is." She said, "I'll think about it." He said, "That's all I'm asking." She picked up her bag. She started toward the door. She stopped. She turned back. She said, "She still wears the locket sometimes, on certain days. I thought you should know that too." She didn't wait for his response. She opened the door and walked out. She called her mother from the car park outside. It was late. The air was cold and her hands were not entirely steady as she found the contact in her phone. Her mother answered on the second ring. She always answered quickly when Grace called late, that particular sharpness that never fully switches off in her parent, and said, "Grace, what's wrong?" Grace said, "Nothing's wrong. I'm okay. Mom, I need you to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." A pause. Then her mother said, very carefully, "All right." Grace said, "I found him, Robert. I went to see him tonight." The silence on the other end was the longest 3 seconds Grace could remember sitting inside. Then her mother said quietly, "Where are you right now?" Grace said, "Outside, in the car park. I'm fine. He didn't hurt me." Her mother said, "Come home." Grace said, "Mom." Her mother said, "Come home first. We'll talk when you're here." Her voice was steady and measured. That steadiness was exactly how Grace knew she was managing something very large and doing it carefully. Grace said, "He asked me to tell you he's sorry. A real sorry is how he put it. He said he knows he has no right to ask for anything. He just wanted you to know." The silence that followed was longer than the first one. Then her mother said, so quietly Grace almost missed it, "Come home, baby." And that was all. Think about that for a moment. Think about being on the other end of that call. You are 46 years old. You built your entire life on the foundation of a choice that was made for you. The choice made the day a man used the word simple to describe what he wanted you to become. You raised a daughter. You built a career. You made a home. You moved forward. And now your 23-year-old daughter is calling from a car park late at night to tell you she found him and that he said he was sorry. If that were you, if that call came in tonight, what would you feel? Would the sorry be enough? Would anything be enough? Or would you just be grateful that your daughter was safe and put everything else in the drawer until morning, because that is what you have always done? Tell us in the comments. Because the people who have been in some version of that position, who have carried something for a very long time and then been offered something that looks like acknowledgement, know that what they feel in that moment is not simple. It is not simple at all. Grace was at her mother's home within 20 minutes. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea ready, the way she always prepared when something needed to be talked through properly. Grace sat across from her and told her everything, in order, from the beginning. The research, the borrowed guest pass, the casino, the guards, the floor, the locket, his face when he opened it, the office, everything he said, everything she said, all of it. Her mother listened without interrupting, the full, present, undivided kind of listening that made people feel held rather than observed. When Grace finished, The kitchen was quiet. Then her mother said, "You could have been seriously hurt." Grace said, "I know." Her mother said, "I told you not to go." Grace said, "I know." Her mother said, "You went anyway." Grace said, "Yes." Another silence. Then her mother said, "You look like him, around the eyes. I've always known it and never said it out loud." Grace looked at her. Her mother said, "The way you hold your ground when you're frightened, that's him. He never looked away from things that scared him either. It was one of the things I admired about him before I understood what that quality was in service of." Grace reached across the table and put her hand on her mother's. She said, "He asked if he could speak to you. He said he has no right to ask, but he wanted you to know it was something he wanted." Her mother looked at her daughter's hand on hers. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the world went on. A car somewhere in the distance, the ordinary sounds of a night that didn't know or care that 23 years of silence had just broken open at a kitchen table. Her mother said, "I don't know what I would say to him." Grace said, "You don't have to know tonight." Her mother said, "I spent a long time not letting myself wonder whether he ever regretted it, because the answer felt like it mattered too much either way." Grace said, "And now?" Her mother looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Now I think I might need to know, even if it's complicated." She picked up her mug. She took a slow sip. Then she said, "I'll think about it." Grace said, "That's all I'm asking." And her mother looked at her daughter, the locket at her collarbone, 23 years old, carrying things the way she had always been taught, and felt something ease in her chest that had been quietly held in place for a very long time.
A few weeks later, Samantha Groves walked into a quiet coffee shop and sat down at a table by the window. She ordered a black coffee. She waited. Robert John Burke came through the door at exactly the time he said he would. She had noted that, the fact that he was on time, because it told her something about how seriously he was taking this. He was older. Of course he was older. They both were. He crossed the room, saw her, and stopped at the table. He said, "Samantha." She said, "Robert." He said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "I almost didn't." He said, "I know." He sat down, and they talked. For 2 hours they talked. Not easily, not at first. There were long silences, and there were moments when what was being said was hard to say and harder to hear. He told her what he had told Grace, that he understood his choice had been selfish, dressed as principled, that he had been afraid, that he had spent years carrying a version of the story that let him avoid looking clearly at what he had actually done. He said it without softening it, without asking her to make it easier for him. She listened, and then she told him what it had actually been like, the pregnancy alone, the early years with Grace, the particular weight of building something solid for a child without a partner, and without any room for the luxury of falling apart. She said it without anger, with a plainness that was harder to sit across from than anger would have been, because plainness doesn't give you anything to push back against. It just asks you to look at it. He looked. She watched him looking. That was something, even if it wasn't everything. When the light through the window had shifted and the space around them had filled with other people going about their ordinary afternoon, Samantha said, "I'm not going to tell you I forgive you today. I don't know yet if that's even the right word for where I eventually land. But I came here, I listened, and I needed to do both of those things for my own reasons, not yours." He said, "I understand that." She said, "Grace is remarkable." He said, "I know. I think that's your work." She said, "It's also hers. She decided who she was going to be. You weren't there. She became someone worth knowing anyway." He looked at the table for a moment. He said, "She came looking for me, even when it was dangerous, even when you told her not to. That's not a small thing." She said, "She has been doing brave things since she could walk. She comes by it honestly."
She stood up. He stood up. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had been carefully not looking for over 20 years, and said, "I don't know what this becomes. I'm not making any promises about that." He said, "I'm not asking you to." She held out her hand. He took it. She said, "It went honestly today. That's better than well." She walked out. The cold air met her face. She stood still on the pavement for a moment and took one long, slow breath and let it out, and something she had been holding carefully for a very long time eased, just slightly, just enough to notice.
In the months that followed, things moved slowly and carefully, because that was the only pace that made any sense for three people trying to build something real out of a complicated history. Grace took the job at the freight company. She was good at it, not in the trying to impress way, but in the way where the work itself makes the quality obvious within weeks. John Nolan was professional and thorough and treated her exactly as what she was, someone who had earned her place on the merits of the work. Robert Chapman gave her a single nod on her first day and treated her no differently from anyone else in the building, which Grace understood as the highest form of respect he was capable of offering. She learned the operation. She asked sharp questions. She found problems in the accounting structure that no one had noticed and fixed them quietly. Robert said nothing directly. She had learned that his silence on something was his version of acknowledgement, and she had accepted it. He was not a man built for casual warmth, but he was consistent. He was there. When she stayed late and came out to an empty street, there was always a car. When her heating stopped working and she mentioned it once in passing, it was fixed within days through a contact she was certain had been arranged without being asked. She filed it all quietly in the part of herself still working out what this person was to her. Some evenings she sat across from him and John Nolan over a meal, and they talked about work and about ordinary things, and it was, slowly, becoming something she looked forward to. She did not say that out loud for a long time. She didn't need to. Samantha and Robert met again, and then once more after that. Not frequently, not easily, but honestly, which was all either of them had to offer, and more than either of them had expected to get. Grace stayed out of it entirely, because whatever happened between her mother and her father had to happen on their terms and in their time, separate from what she was building with each of them on her own. Her mother called her after the third meeting and said, "It's strange, seeing someone across a table who you knew when you were young and trying to reconcile all the different versions of the story you've been telling yourself." Grace said, "Is it bad strange or okay strange?" Her mother thought about it. She said, "Okay strange. I'll know more when I know more." Then she said, "He has your eyes." Grace said, "Mom, you always say it backwards. I have his eyes." Her mother said, "I've been noticing it for 23 years, and I'm only just getting used to having somewhere to put that." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I love you." Her mother said, "I love you too, baby." And they stayed on the call in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the way they always had, the way they would keep doing. What we want to leave you with is not a lesson. Real life rarely hands you clean lessons. What it hands you is the shape of things as they actually unfold it, and what you do with that shape. Samantha Groves did not spend over 20 years waiting for a door to open. She built a life, a real one, a full one, on her own terms, and she raised a daughter who was brave enough to walk through a door that her mother had been wise enough to leave alone until the time was right. Robert John Burke spent years carrying a version of the past that let him avoid looking clearly at what he had actually done. And then one cold night, a young woman ended up on her knees on his floor with a small silver locket at her throat, and the version came apart in under a minute.
And Grace Hendricks, 23 years old, behind on rent, no plan beyond the need to finally look at the face she had wondered about her whole life, walked into a room that could have ended very badly, and walked out of it carrying something she had not gone in expecting to find. Not just a father, a thread that pulled two people back toward a conversation that was over 20 years overdue. A conversation two adults were finally, imperfectly, honestly choosing to have. There is no clean ending here. Real life doesn't wrap that way. What it offers instead, if you are willing to stay in the room when things get hard, is the chance to build something true from what remains. Not a storybook family, not the erasure of what happened. Just three people choosing, slowly and carefully, and with their eyes completely open, to stop leaving certain things unsaid. Grace Hendricks still wears the locket her mother gave her, every single day. Not because it reminds her of the past, but because it reminds her that sometimes the truth you spend your whole life looking for is waiting on the other side of a door you were afraid to open. And on the corner of the desk in Robert John Burke's office, there is a small framed photograph, the only personal photograph anywhere in the building. Everyone who works there has noticed it. No one has ever asked about it. They don't have to. Some things speak entirely for themselves.
So now it is your turn. If you were Samantha, if you had carried something quietly for over 20 years and then been offered a real sorry from the person who caused it, would you have gone to that meeting? Would you have sat across from them and listened and held out your hand at the end? And if you were Grace, if you had grown up your whole life wondering about a father who didn't know you existed, would you have walked through that door the way she did? Or would you have turned around in that car park and driven home and left the drawer closed because some things are safer shut? Tell us in the comments. Every person who watches this story brings their own life to it, and we want to know what yours makes of it. If this stayed with you, if it made you think about someone in your own life, about something still unsaid, about a door still sitting there, please subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, because the next story we share might be exactly what you needed to hear today. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. It means everything.